Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. For those of you who are maybe not very familiar with software design, I hope this is a good introduction and gives you kind of a mental model to get started. For those of you who are very familiar with software design, I'm sure a lot of you are, this should be just a fun twist on very familiar concepts. So I'd like to start with a story from, I think this was probably one of my first jobs. I was a junior engineer. I showed up, I was working on a learning management system, and one of the features I was working on looked something like this. You have a person goes online, does a course, gets a certificate. Really simple stuff, not rocket science. And one day we got a bunch of feature requests, right? I would like to add my own logos to it. I'd like to add my own branding. Maybe for some people, they'd like the certificate right away. For others, they want to get it via email. And of course, I'm eager, I'm new. I say, this is good, we're good to go, easy, I'm going to get this done. Unfortunately, this was a code base that was a big ball of mud. I'm sure a lot of you are cringing right now. I didn't know, but I learned very quickly that this code base was really hard to understand. It was hard to change. And when I changed one thing here, it would break 10 things that were unrelated. So really fun stuff. I mean, software, as the name implies, should be malleable, right? It should be easy to change. And when you have a successful product, when people are using it, they're going to ask for changes. It's almost, the simplest thing around, right? If you're doing something interesting, people are going to use it, they're going to request changes. So why is it that a lot of the times we have this friction, right? We have these kind of constant conversations about, oh, well, we can't do that because that'll take X amount of time, or, this is too complicated. And so I looked back to my early training. I thought a lot about living organisms and how they're really good at adapting. And thought maybe that would be a good inspiration for thinking about software design. This is a dung beetle. Maybe that looked like my code base right there. The dung beetles, they adapt to some really harsh conditions, right? They live in the desert, but they're really amazing organisms. They navigate their surroundings using the stars. They live on very few nutrients. And then you'll have another beetle. There are 400,000 different species of beetles. And then you'll have another beetle that lives somewhere in the rainforest and lives in a completely different environment. And then, you open your backyard and you'll find a beetle there. And that one maybe is more of like a hipster beetle, only eats locally sourced organic food. I might have made up that last part. But at any rate, living organisms are really good at adapting. But this is after billions of years of evolution, so it's hard to learn from that. What we can do is go back many billions of years and see what are the building blocks of life, and if there's anything that we can learn from that. So 4.5 billion years ago, there's no life on Earth as far as we know. The Earth is really hot, there's no oxygen in the atmosphere, the Earth is being bombarded by debris. Not a great place for life. It takes about 1 billion years, but then Earth cools down. This is a picture that my wife actually took on the Ottawa River, close to where I live in Canada. And these are stromatolites. These are remains of the first living organisms on Earth. They're called cyanobacteria. They're little single-celled organisms, and what they do is they take carbon dioxide and water, mix that with a reaction called photosynthesis. You all remember your biology from, I don't know, probably grade 6. And then you get lots of oxygen that is being produced. Actually, most of the oxygen that we breathe today comes from these cyanobacteria. And these structures are all over the world, and some of them are like 3.5 billion years old. So that's kind of our first hint at what life looked like, the first kind of building blocks of life. And if we kind of zoom in, what does that single-celled organism look like? Well, this is a good illustration of that. This is from a book called The Machinery of Life. This is an E. coli, again, another organism that you're all very familiar with, sometimes too intimately familiar with if you get sick from them. But really interesting structure. So what we have here is the green stuff on the outside. There's the thin layer. That's called the cell membrane. I'm sure you've all done a bit of biology and you've seen that. It's packed with proteins, so that's all the purple stuff. And then in the middle, there's DNA. So it's just strands of DNA there. It's a really simple structure. And it has this really nice tail, this flagella, that it uses to swim around in the water. So that's what the kind of single-celled original kind of life looked like. And there's some things we can learn from that. We're talking about really, really small components of life. Micrometers, as in like 1/1,000,000th of a meter, so really, really small. They also, like the first innovation in life is this idea of a cell membrane, this idea of a boundary. You have something on the outside, you have something on the inside, there's a boundary, therefore you have a cell, you have a life. You don't have boundaries, you don't have life. So that's the first innovation in life. This is from that same illustration from that book called The Machinery of Life. If you zoom in, this is what that tail looks like and what that cell membrane looks like. So really small things, but then you might read in the news that we use antibiotics to kill these bacteria if they're bad for us. But over time, they seem to get resistant to this antibiotic, so they're adapting. And how are they doing that? So one cell turns into two. They multiply. But the replication is not perfect. The second one looks slightly different. The DNA is slightly different. Most of the mutations are actually harmless. They do nothing. But then every now and then there's a mutation that makes something new. For example, the structure of the cell membrane might be slightly different, and then the antibiotics might have a harder time clinging to it. And then over time, you have a population with a lot of diversity, just like the population here, which is great to see. So you've got a population, lots of diversity. We hit it with some antibiotics, and they're easily replaced. The ones that are susceptible to those antibiotics die, and the ones that are not, even if they're slightly better at surviving the antibiotics, well, that's good enough, and the population over time adapts to its surroundings. So it's not the individual, but the population that adapts over time. And speaking of these populations, these colonies, they can communicate with each other. They can send each other messages, and they can talk to each other. They can send these molecules across, and they can talk to each other. And you can actually see them with your eyes. You can do this at home. If you have kids, you can do the classic experiment. Go to Amazon, search for agar, A-G-A-R, and you get these petri dishes with some sugar on them. And then you can do the fun experiment of like getting bacteria from different places of the house, like a keyboard and a toilet seat or something. And then you might be surprised what you get. But it's fun. The kids can see them. It's very visual. When I taught biology, that's what I did. Any way to engage the students, right? So how does this relate to software? Well, obviously, I'm not the only one who's thought of this. In fact, Alan Kay, who coined the term object-oriented programming, he had a biology background, and he thought of objects as kind of these little cells that were communicating with each other, and that's what made our program, right? Lots of little cells communicating with each other. And so our first lesson, if there's any inspiration to take from this, is that we should build really small components. We should make sure they have really strong boundaries, and we can compose them with messages. So by components, I mean things like modules and classes, and by methods, by messages, I mean like methods, or a more advanced topic, events. We won't get into it here. That could be a whole topic on its own. So let's go through an example just to see what that might look like. But before that, just a quick, like when you're building these small components, you get immediately some benefits, which is they're really small, they fit in your head, easy to reason about. They're easy to change, and they're easier to test. But we'll see that in practice. So this is our initial kind of big ball of mud. We have one class, it's called certificate, and it takes in 10 inputs, and then it accesses the database, it goes to the file system, it accesses S3, it does everything, and it does some things that we don't even know it's doing. So there's no clear boundary here. There is no clear idea of what's outside and what's inside. It simply does the entire kind of certificate generation experience. And some might say, well, that's, a singular thing that it does, so it could be one thing, but I think it's a bit too much. So what we could do is redesign it into smaller components. So we could do one component that looks like this. It takes in one input. An enrollment is just a database entry that says so-and-so took this course. So it takes in one enrollment. It does not access the database. It just simply gets a data structure. And then it has very few exit points. It can tell you what the title is of the certificate. It can tell you what the subtitle is and a date. So really strong boundaries because there's only one entry point and only a few exit points. And then in addition to that, we add a couple of components to do the rest of what our program should be doing. So we'll add a template class, and it takes in one component. So a certificate, that last one. And then it only responds to one message, which is render, and then it gives us back some HTML. And then for S3, we have a component that takes in 2 entry points, so a certificate and some HTML, and it has only one exit point. You call save, and it simply saves and tells you where it saved it. So visually, this is what our design would look like. Instead of having one big kind of organism doing things, it's actually like a little colony of little components. And they can talk to each other, right? You can send them these messages, title, subtitle, date, render, save, and each one does its own thing. One immediate benefit, as I said, is you can refactor one component without affecting the others. So now we have less risk. Instead of me changing one thing and then breaking 10 things that are seemingly unrelated, this way, when you isolate one component that you want to change and change that, you might not affect the other ones. Another nice benefit is that we can replace components. So we have an S3 file component, and we could replace it with a temp file component. As long as it responds to that method called save, then it can easily fit into that place there. And now instead of saving to S3, maybe it saves somewhere temporary, and then somebody might download that file. So some time goes by. I'm sure we've all done this. You build a bunch of components, and then over time, our system has 1,000 of these little components, and someone will tell you, oh, wow, this code base has too many components. There's a lot of indirection. If I want to figure out how these 3 things fit together, I don't know. I would have to read everything. And that's fair. It's a fair criticism, and I think our design can be made better. So let's go back to life and see, how does life deal with multicellular structures? And one of the early multicellular life would actually look something like this. So this is a stovepipe sponge. Really cool organism. So the individual cell actually looks a lot like the E. coli that I showed you, with the cell membrane and the tail. But what it does is it secretes a protein called collagen, and then a lot of these cells come together. They secrete this collagen structure, and that forms the pipe. And then their tails are actually pointing inside the pipe, and they move their tails in unison to pump water through the pipe. And when they're pumping the water through the pipe, nutrients flow, and they filter that and get their nutrients. So rather than needing to, go around and get their nutrients, they actually just sit there in a pipe that's made of this collagen, and they get their nutrients. So the structure is not only giving them a distinctive look, you can look at it and say, oh, that's a stovepipe sponge, but it's actually also giving them additional functionality. And Collagen is actually such a great innovation in life that you find it in our bodies. Our skin, our hair, our nails have a lot of collagen. So life doesn't waste innovations, right? You keep seeing things repeat. So that's what we want to do. We want to give our design a bit more structure, kind of like a protein mesh around it, to both give it a visual distinction and also maybe give it an additional capability. So there's a few ways you can do this. The first example here, we made a folder called compliance. And a lot of you might be saying, well, what is compliance? So that is domain-specific knowledge, meaning this is domain-specific language. This is language that is specific to that those people, right? The customers, what we're working on. And in this case, compliance means you have to take that course. CPR training is required, you have to take it. And so that's what we did here. We created a folder, named it compliance. And in Ruby, it doesn't need to be a namespace. It doesn't need to be in your code. It can just be a folder. And now anytime we have anything compliance related, any compliance related feature, we'll put it there. We created another folder called certificate, and that's a namespace. So that'll be a module called certificate. And that's how we bring together these three components. So now if somebody is interested in the certificate code, how do we, print certificates in our code base? Well, they'll just open up the certificate folder and they'll see those three components right there. We also added a coordinator class, that's the generator.rb. And this is what it does. So namespace certificate, our class is a generator, and there's a couple of ways you can compose components. So this is showing you two options. One is we assume the name of the components, right? We just assume that our three components are certificate base, certificate template, certificate S3 file. And it just puts them together, generates a certificate. Another way to do it is to actually expect that whoever calls the method to tell you what those names are. So you might see this referred to as like dependency injection. And in that case, there's a bit more flexibility because, for example, for our saving strategy, we don't have to assume that we're saving to S3. Whoever is passing us the name of the classes can give us that temp file component that we talked about earlier. So instead of S3, they send us the temp file component. And now instead of saving to S3, we actually save to the temp file. So two ways of doing composition, but really relatively simple stuff. And we have, I think, a much better design now. But of course, there are always going to be things that we have to think about. So one thing we haven't thought about is this idea of side effects. So if you've done some functional programming, you're familiar with this. But for those people who are not, I'll just give you a quick intro to what side effects are. So anytime you interact with the outside world, in this case, if our program is interacting with a database or going to an API or raising errors or printing on a screen on a device somewhere, anytime you're interacting with the outside world, it's risky. It might fail, right? We have to deal with both the success state and the error state. And in that case, things are risky, and we have to be mindful of side effects. So a quick example of, the one kind of outlier here is mutable data. But here's like a quick example. If you're working with like a Rails application, you can assume that params is like a hash, right? And it has some data in it, name, John. Now you call some method that a colleague wrote, or it's in a gem somewhere. Do something with this params, right? And there's a type with there's a params with an S. So you give them that hash, and they modify it. They mutate it. And then when you call that params name again, you get an unexpected result, which is the data has changed. I've seen some bugs in our code base with stuff like this where the data mutates, the data changes, and you don't know that it changed. You expect it to be the same. So just something to be mindful of. So Again, we'll go back to life and see, is there any inspiration we can get from living organisms? So about 600 million years ago, we start seeing the first signs of a nervous system. And in fact, life becomes very dynamic at that point. Lots of organisms kind of interacting with each other. And in the fossil record is called the Cambrian explosion, where there's just so much different variety of life. This is a common jellyfish, and it has a really simple nervous system. So it's called a nerve net. And the way it works is you've got a bunch of organs on the outside that interact with the outside world, and then they send electrical signals through nerves. And then the organism responds in a deterministic way. So always in a similar way. So for example, it has an organ that senses touch. So you touch the bell, and it will sense that you've touched it, and it will move away. So always the response is move away. It also has something like the human eye. Of course, the human eye forms images, but for the jellyfish, it doesn't form an image, but it can sense light. And so it can then respond according to where the light is. It also has something like the human inner ear, which is a crystal suspended in a solution. And depending on where the crystal is, it knows what's up and what's down. So really simple organs that tell it specific things about the outside world, and then it responds in a deterministic way, as in same thing every time. Yep. So we can do that. We can push the side effects or our interaction with the outside world to the edges of our program, just like a jellyfish would do. So here's what our design might look like. We'll have a nerve net. If we're interacting with a database, or we're interacting with a device or something like that, then that'll be on the outside of our program. It's just a mental model, right? We're just imagining that that's the outside, and then we have our code on the inside. And then deterministic responses in code, the simplest example is this, right? An add function. Takes in 2 arguments. You give it 1 and 1, it's always going to give 2. So our design, just visually, this is what it could look like, right? We have our 3 components. They always respond in the same way. So when we call title or subtitle or date on our component, it's always going to respond in the same way if we give it the same data. Same thing with the HTML rendering, right? It should be rendering the same HTML given that we give it a specific certificate. And then I put the generator class, that's the coordinator class, I put it kind of like on the outside. This is just, again, visualizing what our design looks like because it might do some database access. So that one is a bit risky. I put it in red. And then let's imagine that S3 is actually a gem that we're interacting with. Maybe S3 is a gem, or maybe you've wrapped an S3 API. In that case, that's the outside. And we're just being mindful of what's on the outside and what's on the inside. And then for our components, we're going to try to be as deterministic as possible. That way, it's easier to test if you don't have to take care of errors and things like that. And then as time goes on, obviously, we're going to be asked to do some changes. And let's say, for example, delivery method changes based on some logic. Well, we want that logic to be deterministic, right? Given a student in an organization, it will always be by email that they get their certificate. Or for this organization, they get it right away. Or in this condition, they get it right away. So that we wrap that logic inside, and then any interaction with HTTP or email, we try to keep kind of on the edges. And if you're curious, what does an edge look like? We're talking about things like controllers, where you're interacting with the user, and then you can give them an error message, or background jobs you could retry. or a mailer or rake task or something like that. So that's the edit of our program. And we can do some riskier stuff there. And then for our core of our program, we'll try to do less risky stuff there. So we started with this beautiful E. coli, and I'd like to give you one last example with our familiar E. coli. So this E. coli doesn't have a brain. It does not have a nervous system, but it swims around and finds its food. It's really good at swimming around, finding food sources and eating it. So how does it do that? The way it does that is called a run and tumble. So it's a two-step process. It has a tail that it moves clockwise, and that pushes it forward, so in a straight line. And then what it does is it senses the concentration of sugar in its surroundings. If the concentration of sugar is going up, that means that it's heading in the right direction, right? The food source is somewhere out there, and the concentration of sugar is telling it it's heading in the right direction. But if the concentration of sugar is going down, it means it's actually the wrong way. It's heading the wrong way. It's moving away from the food source. So what it will do this tumble. And instead of moving its tail clockwise, it will move its tail counterclockwise, and that will spin it in a random direction. And it will start all over again. And then it will do a run, move forward, sense its surroundings. Oh, it's heading in the right direction. If it's not, it'll keep doing a run and tumble. So visually, this is what it looks like. They don't necessarily know where they're going. They keep trying, right? And then at some point, they'll get to their destination. And I share that because software design can sometimes feel like a run and tumble, right? You don't know what to name things, or you'll name things wrong. You might not know the domain language, right? You're new to a company. You don't know that space. You might be too eager, like I've done in the past, and build too many components, right? And then somebody will say, could you just scale that back a bit? And then you'll take that feedback in and maybe redesign it with fewer components. Or, again, I've done the same, build too few components, right? And the components start getting really, really big. And then what you could do is start extracting components. So our designs aren't going to be perfect. Our goal is to ship working software. Our goal is to ship products. And so we need to find a balance, right? Ship something that you're happy with, but give yourself some grace, give yourself some space. Do the best you can, but also ship it. Because I've seen junior engineers who will sit there and retry and keep on redesigning. But you can go ahead and ship it. And if the software is being used, if it is helpful to people, you'll get another opportunity, right? Somebody will ask for a change, and you'll come back to it. Or maybe the performance isn't great, and you'll notice that in your logs, and you'll come back and try to improve it. So design is iterative. It'll take some time. So in conclusion, build small components, right? Make sure they have strong boundaries. A few inputs, a few outputs. Naming and structure. It's surprising, I know, but a lot of people don't think that you can go beyond, model view controller, but you can, and Ruby makes it really easy. So give them structure, give folder structure and naming structure. Make sure that you're imagining your design as not modeling the real world necessarily, but actually building a living organism or a set of living organisms that talk to each other. And then be mindful of the risky stuff, right? The side effects. And try to push that as far away from you as possible so that you know what's risky and what's not. And keep that in your head. And then last but not least, run and tumble until you get a better design. Okay, thank you.